I'm Deacon Jamison. Joyce is my better half. So she does the music, I do the science, right? She does the fine arts, I do the liberal arts. I got interested in math and science and philosophy in high school when I was your age. So I went to a public high school. I was raised Protestant. I converted later through science and philosophy. Really, that's what really helped me. Cleared the ground, kind of a preamble to faith. Removed some of the obstacles and opened my horizons up a little bit so I could get a different perspective. But in high school, I had science courses, some of which were good and some were bad. But the ones that were good were very good. And the teachers were very helpful to me in understanding how science works. And so I got very interested in geology. And I continued that study in college, the study of geology. And that took me into archaeology. It was very helpful to see how science works and understand what these theories are based on. I was raised in an environment that was pretty fundamentalist. Like the Creation Museum, I was raised in that kind of environment. But as I began to study geology, I began to learn about the age of the Earth and considering the evidence for that. Things like continental glaciation. You know, you go out in the middle of a field and you find a boulder out there that has ice markings on it that can only be made by a glacier. You have to begin to consider the evidence and think, hey, there's a lot to be said, right? There's a lot of warrant for these theories that are available. And so it's not something you could just dismiss, although a lot of people in my environment were very anti-science. And so I struggled with that growing up. That was a struggle for me about what to do with science, how to harmonize faith and reason. I had that struggle with the empirical sciences. I had that struggle with the moral sciences as well. You might be familiar with this kind of Venn diagram chart that we often use for the truths of faith and reason. Did any of your speakers go over this with you before? The faith and reason charts? Oh, well, I lost it already. Let me pull it up here. All right. All right, so it's a simple little Venn diagram we use to put together and consider what are the different ways, what are the logical possibilities for harmonizing faith and reason. Well, these represent philosophical schools of thought. And half the battle in philosophy, in faith and reason, is figuring out what philosophy would enable us to harmonize faith and reason and which ones are hostile to faith and reason. So rationalism says all that is known by faith is also known by reason, but not all that is known by reason is known by faith. That would make faith to be a subclass of reason. So the circle there under faith would be empty. All the truths of faith would be within reason. So that's the only way I had to do it on this PowerPoint. So I just put full and full there to show you that those areas are populated. You can see how rationalism empties out the faith. In other words, I'll only believe it if I can ground it in reason and proof, right? That's rationalism. Are you familiar with these diagrams? Did anybody use them with you before? Have you studied these for faith and reason, for apologetics? Well, all right, let's just do the next one. Fideism is the opposite. Notice that the circle for reason is now empty. Fideism says all that is known by reason is also known by faith, but not all that is known by faith is known by reason. That would make reason a subclass of faith. So, I will only believe what faith tells me is true. A fundamentalist would say, perhaps, I will only believe it if it's in the Bible or in the Quran, right? I will only accept as credible and believable what my religion tells me or my sacred text tells me. Reason and science, I don't trust them. They aren't reliable. Many Protestants have this attitude because they have kind of an anti-intellectual view. They believe the intellect is fallen and is not reliable apart from true religion. And so they're very skeptical about science. They doubt it, right? So when you talk about continental glaciation or the age of the Earth or, evolutionary biology or anything like that, they immediately, a curtain goes down in their head and they just turn it off and they're not willing to weigh the evidence. So fideism would just be bracketing reason altogether, and science goes with it. Obviously, these first two positions are not Catholic, right? These are not Catholic positions. These are positions taken by secularists and Protestants. Reductionism is the third possibility. All that is known by faith is known by reason too, and all that is known by reason is known by faith. That means they completely overlap and they're interchangeable. They're coextensive. Faith and reason are the same thing. This is a view that says whenever we know something true, it's by faith and reason together. And so faith and reason are reducible to each other. Nature and grace are always working together, and everything that we know is known with the help of God's intervention and God infusing truths into us. Some people call that theologism. All right, the fourth position is secularism. You're most familiar with this because it's the most prevalent in our society. Nothing that is known by faith is known by reason, and nothing that is known by reason is known by faith. Faith and reason are mutually exclusive. So, you have truths of faith, you have truths of reason, but there's no overlap whatsoever. Those are just separate components, separate parts in my mind, right? A person like this would say. And I keep those separate. What I know by faith, I know by faith. What I know by reason, I know by reason. And it's all right if they don't completely agree, because those are two different worlds. They exist separately, two different domains of truth that don't have to be integrated, and it's okay. That's kind of cognitive dissonance, isn't it? A lot of people live with that. That's very much where they are in their life. But the Catholic position is here. This is the Catholic position. Partial exclusion and partial inclusion. Some but not all that is known by faith is known by reason, and but not all that is known by reason is also known by faith. Faith and reason partially but irreducibly overlap. So that would be St. Augustine, St. Boethius, St. Thomas Aquinas, Blessed John Duns Scotus. All the big major hitters in Catholic theology ascribe to this view. So there are truths of faith per se. We call those the mysteries of the faith, that only faith can tell us about. Reason can't go there. And then there are the truths of reason, which faith doesn't tell us about. Those would be truths of science, like water is H2O, right? Our faith doesn't tell us that water is H2O. That's something that we've figured out by experiment and deduction. But then there are the truths that overlap. There are the truths that are both approachable through faith and approachable through reason at the same time. That would be, for example, the existence of God. You can know it by reason, and you can know it by faith. Faith is better, but reason gets us a long way. To know that God is Trinity, though, that would be a mystery of the faith. There's no way to prove by reason alone that God is Trinity. That's something we know because we take God's word for it. Most moral truths are in the middle. So we know by reason that it's wrong to murder people, right? So we know those within reason itself, and there are certain truths, like in the Declaration of Independence, the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know those kinds of truths by reason, but our faith also affirms those basic truths. So a lot of morality falls right in the middle, right there. It can be approached by faith or by reason. And that's the situation that we're in as we try to harmonize faith and reason and bring it together into one understanding, one overall interpretation of our life, our world, and God's plan for our happiness. So the church has always been the patroness of reason and science. This propaganda that we've been fed, I hope you understand, is largely false. It comes out of the Enlightenment, right? The church is not opposed to science. The church has always been supportive of science. And the church is hesitant to pronounce on strictly scientific matters. So the church is always cautious. There are certain episodes in history that people bring up, And we can talk about those if you'd like to. But a lot of what's been told comes out of Enlightenment propaganda. When you look at the church and you look at how science developed, the church was at the heart of it. You know, medieval scientists like Albert the Great amassed huge scientific collections of facts and specimens and everything. I mean, he really amassed a huge amount of science that could be built on later. And if it weren't for these monks doing this science, the modern age wouldn't have got off the ground. We need to understand that and see the big picture. And there's always been a lot of priests who specialized in science. And again, we could look at any number of them. But let's take a look at one in particular here. You might have heard of him.
That a scientist could be a believing Catholic, let alone a priest. Some have even suggested that believing scientists only pretend to believe, to fit in. But did you know that the father of the Big Bang model of how the universe began was a Catholic priest? In fact, this man's faith may have instilled in him a deep sense of wonder and inspired his groundbreaking research into the origin of the universe. Georges Lemetra was a Belgian Catholic priest and astronomer who made an extraordinary number of contributions to our understanding of the cosmos in the 1920s and 1930s. He thought deeply throughout his life about the role of God in the creation of the universe. In this video, we'll go over just one example from his remarkable body of work. In 1931, Lemetra produced a typewritten draft of a paper outlining a theory about the beginning of the cosmos, what would come to be known as the Big Bang. The finished paper has since become one of the most important works published in the 20th century about the origins of the universe, and astronomers today regard it as the foundation for everything we are doing in cosmology. Lemetra was preparing to send his manuscript to the famous journal Nature. In a scientific paper like that, one would not expect his views on God to intrude. And yet, his draft contains an extra sentence at the very end, one that does not appear in the published paper, that he crossed out with a pencil. It reads, "I think that everyone who believes in a supreme being supporting every being and every acting believes also that God is essentially hidden and may be glad to see how present physics provides a veil hiding the creation." This single sentence is loaded with information on Lemetra's views of the nature of God and his role as creator. Let's try to unpack it. Lemetra thinks of God as hidden, and he was not the first to say that. The Judeo-Christian concept of the hidden God goes back to a verse in chapter 45 of Isaiah. But here, Lemetra takes it one step further and suggests that the physics itself hides the act of creation. This is not an entirely religious or philosophical view. It may just be Lemetra's lyrical way of expressing what is generally accepted about the Big Bang, that one cannot use physics to learn what happened in the cosmos before the Big Bang. Indeed, in some views, time itself began as part of the Big Bang. Such an idea, without the astrophysics involved, goes back to St. Augustine in the early 5th century. The famous scientist Stephen Hawking, an atheist, cites it as well. Lemetra himself asserts this idea earlier in his Nature paper. And elsewhere he says, "Any pre-existence of the universe has a metaphysical character. Physically, everything happens as if the theoretical zero was really a beginning." Now let's return to the first part of Lemetra's redacted sentence from the Nature letter, where he refers to God as supporting every being and every acting. This important excerpt reveals his understanding of Aquinas' view of God as pure act. For Lemetra, God is not a clockmaker, a disengaged creator who starts the mechanisms of the cosmos and then leaves the scene. Instead, he very much holds the view of God espoused by St. Thomas Aquinas and also by Aristotle, that God is the source of the actuality by which the universe exists at every moment. Let me break this down for you. Aquinas saw the world as divided between potency and act or actuality. The things around us in nature are not only what they actually are, but also what they can be. A pot of water on the stove is actually cold and potentially hot. But once it is on a hot burner for some time, the potentiality to be hot becomes actualized. Aristotle realized that everything that changes goes from potentially being something to actually being something. But why does the potentiality of things become actual? After all, potentiality does not realize itself on its own. To answer this question, Aristotle and Aquinas argued that the influence of act on something potential could not run backwards infinitely. There cannot be an infinite chain of things where each is actualized by something else. There must be some ultimate source of act, something that is itself pure act, without any potentiality in it. And that, they argued, is God. Another way to look at this, as Aquinas did, is through the concepts of essence and existence, or being. One can readily describe the essence of a human or of a unicorn, but neither necessarily exists. Indeed, of the two, only the human truly exists as a material being. Thus, the essence of something and its existence are distinct. Whatever gives the human existence must itself be given existence, and so forth, until one arrives recursively, according to Aquinas, at pure being, something whose essence is existence itself. And that, Aquinas says, is the God who revealed himself in the 2nd chapter of Exodus to Moses as I am that am. The subtlety here in Aquinas' reasoning, and this is crucial, is that the ordering is not in time. This led to that, which led to another thing, etc. It is hierarchical. So all of material reality, everything that participates in existence, must be sustained at every moment by pure being, pure act, that is, by God. And this is exactly what Lemetra says, a supreme being supporting every being and every acting. To me, it is clear that Lemetra's view of God is the Thomistic view, the God who lends existence to everything, all the time, who creates in a timeless fashion ex nihilo, from nothing. And so, in that view, Lemetra's Big Bang is not the creation of everything, which happens timelessly in God's eternal now, but the beginning of the temporal evolution of the universe. Just as the North Pole is the spatial origin point from which one moves progressively southward on a sphere, but is not the origin of that sphere in terms of creation. Lemetra himself was somewhat elusive on this point, saying, "We may speak of this event as of a beginning. I do not say a creation. Physically, it is a beginning in the sense that if something happened before, it has no observable influence on the behavior of our universe. The question, if it was really a beginning, or rather a creation, something started from nothing, is a philosophical question which cannot be settled by physical or astronomical considerations." his own lifetime, Lemetra was rewarded for both his scientific accomplishments and his work as a priest. As a scientist in 1934, he won the lucrative Franck Prize for his research, and he was nominated for that honor by none other than Albert Einstein. As a Catholic priest in 1960, Lemetra was named a prelate of the papal household by Pope John XXIII, thereby earning him the title of Monsignor. In all that he did, throughout his whole life, Georges Lemetra saw the harmony between our scientific inquiry into the nature of the cosmos and our worship of the God who created it all, and us. As Lemetra said in accepting the Franck Prize, "Science is beautiful. It deserves to be loved for itself, as it is a reflection of God's creative thought." For readings, podcasts, and more videos like this, go to Aquinas101.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for one of our free video courses on Aquinas. And don't forget to like and share with your friends, because it matters what you think.
Okay, the good Dominicans at the Thomistic Institute are putting out many good videos that I hope that you would begin to use if you're not already, that you can see all the different ones they have there. But you can take a course on faith and reason, science and religion. You can explore their different videos, watch them individually. You don't have to take a course. You can just watch them and benefit from them. So probably the most important thing I can leave you with here this evening is learn Thomistic philosophy and the understanding of science and reason, and you'll be set for life. If you take advantage of these opportunities, if you're allowed to have access to the internet and so on, that you work that out with your parents. But I would very much encourage your parents to get you involved in the study of science and philosophy with the Thomistic Institute. Aquinas 101 has many great courses. And I can only say a few things this evening, but you can go very deep into this, and it will help prepare you for college, right? Because at college your faith will be challenged. This is how you can begin to understand the faith in a way that will show you how to respond to the different ideologies that you will encounter as you go off to college and have that experience. I myself had to deal with that. And Thomas Aquinas often helped me, right? He often was the path to harmonize faith and reason. Now, you see that a lot of these issues are metaphysical. So our quarrel is not with the science. The difficulty we have is the different philosophies that are used to interpret the sciences. Now, for Aristotle, his notion of causality is very robust. Perhaps you've been taught this in your catechism classes or some other forum. But Aristotle believes that causes come at 4 levels. There's formal cause, that which makes the thing that which it is. It makes it what it is. It gives it its essence. The material cause, the matter out of which the thing is made. The efficient cause is the agent that produces the change in the thing. And then the final cause, the end or goal for the sake of which the agent acts in producing the change. Aristotle gave us the logic and the metaphysics that gave birth to science. That's why he's called the father of Western science, right? There were other philosophers like him in other cultures, and what they had in common was this robust understanding of causality. When you have causality at all these levels simultaneously, and your science can take account of that, then it's very easy to infer to the existence of God as the ultimate cause. There are 2 paths to God here. Final cause would be God as the ultimate good and our ultimate happiness, our end for which we exist. And then efficient cause is God as creator. God is the agent that produces our existence. But there's a big difference between what science studies and what Aristotle studies with regard to this kind of divine causality or pure act. In this presentation by our good physicist friend on Lemetra, you saw a number of key distinctions, one of which, the Big Bang is not the act of creation, is it? Right? There's a difference there. So we shouldn't confuse that. There might be, an infinite number of Big Bangs. That's logically possible. But that's not what we mean by creation. We don't have a view of God that he's this watchmaker that's just winding the world up and starting it, right? He's not the big generator. God is a creator. That's a different kind of act. To generate is different than to create. God is the essence who exists by its very nature. And that is unique to God's being. That means he transcends all other existence. All other existence is contingent upon God. Now, you have to choose in what philosophical framework, what metaphysics, to interpret your science. There's some books here that you might get familiar with and use. That one's designed for high schoolers. That's designed for a high school curriculum. You can take a look at some of the resources that are available. But there are basically four major philosophies which are used to interpret the sciences. In the 20th century, the major school of thought was materialism and empiricism. That's pretty much dead these days. That died in the 60s. You probably have heard about the crazy 60s, right? And all the hippie movement and all that. That was very much connected to what was going on in the sciences as empiricism died and people didn't know what to replace, to turn to next. Some people turned to relativism. So you've got empiricism, you've got relativism, then you have a kind of in-between, which is pragmatism, which means science is just about what works, right? Truth is utility for the pragmatists. But for Aristotle, he's a realist. And a realist says that science is about causes, and causes involve all these levels simultaneously. The quarrel that we have in the 20th century is not with biology, chemistry, physics, none of that. All of these sciences can be interpreted in different frameworks. Our quarrel is with those who try to reduce these causes down to either just two or none. Our quarrel is with the empiricists, not the scientists, right? So if you think of the new atheists, what are they about? Those are just old-style empiricists. That's what they are. Our quarrel is not with the biology, not with the science. Our quarrel is with the empiricism and the materialism that is assumed by people like Richard Dawkins and others who use science as propaganda to motivate their philosophy. Science doesn't have to be interpreted that way. You can interpret science with a completely realist framework. And there are many secularists who do that, all right? There are many non-Christians who believe that a form-matter kind of analysis that you get from Aristotle is the very logic that science uses. So there are these competing interpretations of the sciences that come into play in these kinds of dialogues. All right, so that's a little background. You can see why it takes us into metaphysics. He introduced you to act potency metaphysics. That's basic. That way of thinking is basic to the Catholic understanding of the faith, right? Form, matter, act, potency is how we interpret reality in general. We can interpret the sciences that way. The causal relations. All being is either in act or in potency, right? You are not only what you actually are at this moment, you are also your potency. You have a potency built into your being, and that is a real part of you as well. So reality is composed of actuality and potentiality. You are the potentialities that you have by nature, as well as what you are actually at present. Aristotle understands that. When you understand that, then you have a different view of the human person. Notice how that informs moral debates as well as scientific debates. Suppose you believe that you're only what you actually are. Well, think about the fetus in the womb, the baby in the womb, Is the baby in the womb a person? It hasn't actualized its intellectual abilities yet. You see, the materialists want to reduce everything down to actualities. It's the realists, the Aristotelians and the Catholics, right, who believe in potentiality. No, that baby in the womb is a full human person with full intellectual powers, and those powers will be actualized as the baby develops, right? And so you have to recognize that those potencies are part of the nature even when they aren't actualized. That's key, right? That's very important. If you understand the reality of potentialities, if you've got that in place, then you can explain science and you can explain morality. The modern era is a crisis of abandoning that kind of thinking. The modern era abandons realism for either empiricism or idealism or pragmatism, or just what we got now is outright relativism, right? That's what we're dealing with. So you can see how that all bears on how you think about science. All right, I'll just open it up now for whatever direction you want to take this, and I'm fine with whatever you want to talk about. So what do you have questions about? But the topic is faith and reason, science and religion. What would you like to talk about briefly in the time that we have? You tell me. Yes.
Okay, so with potency and all that, of what a person can be,
Yeah.
does that potency die off if it never becomes that? Like, let's say you're going to grow to something up to a certain size eventually.
Yeah.
Well, let's say something happens to you and you lose that ability to keep growing. Does that potency die off, or how does the church teach on that?
There are potencies which, if you don't use them, if you don't actualize them, they will die off. There are other potencies that you cannot lose. So there's a whole hierarchy of potencies that we have. An example would be, when you're young, you have a strong potency to acquire a natural language. It's much easier when you're young to become a native speaker of a particular language. I think all of us here have actualized the potency to speak English, right? Probably very few of us have actualized the potency to speak Chinese. The older that you get, the harder it'll be. It would be easier for you to learn Chinese than me. It would be very difficult for me because I'm older. I'm losing that potency, right? And the older I get, the less potency I will have for that. I could, if I had to, if I was thrown into a situation where, but I would never really master it the way I've mastered English because the potency has diminished there. So there are potencies that you lose if you use it or lose it. And there are other potencies which you never lose, that you always have. Yeah.
And what about potencies? Could you develop them? Is it possible to develop potency, or would that never happen?
Yes, that's very good. Because not only do we have innate potencies, we also have acquired potencies. So we have potencies to acquire potencies. And a lot of times, that's what's going on in our lives when we are making gains in particular. We are not just, we're actualizing our potency to acquire other potencies. And so he who has more gets more, right? It just kind of like a ball. It takes off and it gets momentum. And that's part of what learning happens in learning. So that's an important distinction. Aristotle had a whole metaphysics that laid out all of those distinctions and insisted that potencies were real, right? Potencies are, just because someone hasn't actualized their potency doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. No, it exists. Being is that which is, either in act or in potency. The materialists deny that, right? Richard Dawkins doesn't believe that. What do they say? They say there's only two kinds of causes. There's matter, which is just atoms in the void. It's just extension, right? That's all matter is. It's not really a potency for him. And there is efficient causality. So in the modern era, the attack was on formal and final causality. They wanted to throw out all formal causes and all final causes. You can see how that turns the world into a big machine. Well, in the 20th century, that fell apart. Mechanism, as a way of understanding the cosmos, actually died. So people like Richard Dawkins are throwbacks, right? They're has-beens. The academic world understands they're on the way out. And what's happening now in the sciences is a return to realism, a return to Aristotle. Things are very optimistic these days, and it's amazing to see this philosophical shift that's happening. Many philosophers would say, well, nowadays, empiricism and materialism are dead. Most people are trying to make pragmatism work, but that's not working out very well. So what are the major positions these days? A lot of philosophers and scientists these days believe you're either going to go with Aristotle and a realism to understand science, or you're going to go with a relativism. So realism or relativism, that's what you're left with. And a lot of people are choosing relativism. That's what they, since everything changed in the 20th century, that's where a lot of people have gone. And they've just embraced a complete devoid of science being workable at all. And so there's great new skepticism about science. But the scientists themselves and science itself is hanging on and returning to formal and final causes. That's Aristotle. Now, Aristotle had an astronomy that was messed up. That's true. But the point is, Aristotle had a logic and a metaphysics that is self-correcting. And so people like Galileo and others, they were Aristotelians. If you look at the discussion between Bellarmine and Galileo, they agreed on the nature of science. And the proof that Bellarmine asked for was an Aristotelian proof that Galileo agreed that he needed. The problem was, he thought he was going to get it next week, and he never got it. It only came after he died, right? It was long after he died, we came up with the proof, and we were able to prove it, and prove that he was right. But at the time, he didn't have it. But the thing to notice is, Bellarmine wasn't like, we're going to, stick to one interpretation of the Bible. Bellarmine was defending Aristotle. And Galileo agreed with him. It turns out that Aristotle's astronomy, right, was wrong, but the method being used was the Aristotelian logic. It was the same method. That's important to understand. All right, what other question would you like to talk about? What else? If you want to see the historical overview, here it is, right? Realism dominated in the Middle Ages. Science really took off when you had the recovery of Aristotle in the West, and St. Albert the Great and others began to do empirical science. Science got a new birth, and it really took off. The great medieval syntheses were very much Aristotelian realist understanding of science. It's the modern age, which begins around 1600, that everything they were trying to mechanize everything. And so there was a renewal of some of the ancient errors, like rationalism and idealism, empiricism and materialism. They tried to make that work. That project continued up to 1950, and then it fell apart. It fell apart, and everybody didn't know what to do. I can remember this crisis in my public school system, when the age of Aquarius hit. I can remember it vividly. Everything changed in our school system. People's attitude towards science changed. It was like, well, the modern age kind of died here, and the whole truth thing didn't work out, so now what do we live for? And for a lot of people, it was like, well, let's go smoke some dope or whatever. I mean, that's what they turned to. They turned to drugs and, experiences and all kinds of crazy, immoral things they would get into because they didn't have anything to live for anymore. The whole big Enlightenment project just folded up, and that was it. What do we do now, right? And a lot of people are still stuck in that. People a little bit older than I am, that was a big problem in their life, that they're still wrestling with that. Well, the Catholic answer has always been the same. Let's go back to realism, right? Stick with the four causes, stick with act and potency, stick with form and matter, and we can make sense of science, including evolutionary biology and all the rest. but you can't reduce, biology down to materialism. You can't reduce the human person down to an accident, right? That is not sustainable. That is not a tenable position to maintain. And that people like Richard Dawkins, who are trying to make that work, they're out of date and they're out of touch with where science and philosophy have gone, right? They're throwbacks. And you got to understand that about them. I sympathize with what the Creation Museum's doing, but frankly, they're as messed up as Dawkins, right? They take a skeptical attitude towards science, and that doesn't work either. This has always been a strategy that you've seen in a lot of Christian circles at times. They run skeptical arguments against reason, and then they run faith to the rescue. What's that position called we started with? Which one of those 5 positions is that? If you run skeptical arguments against reason and then try to bring in the truths of the faith to bail you out, what is the name of that position? Do you remember? Anybody get it? That was fideism, all right? Fideism. It's the Latin word for faith, fideism, all right? The Creation Museum is lost in fideism. Dawkins is lost in rationalism. Neither of those are workable. And frankly, we need to move on and just integrate. So postmodernism is either going to be back to full realism or embrace a relativism altogether. And some people just say truth is power, and the only truth I know is to assert my will, and so I'm just going to seize power, and that's what I'm going to live for, right? So that's an option that a lot of people have always throughout history found attractive, but it always terminates in violence, and that's the problem, right? When you lose reason and faith and the ability to integrate them, the outcome is violence. All right, any other questions, or you want to ask about anything here? Or have you had enough? Had enough of this, right? I hope you'll I can send you this PowerPoint that has all these links in it, and you can watch videos for hours on end on all these topics if you're interested, because the Dominicans are really putting out a lot of good material. But I don't know if you're allowed to do that or whatever. I can give it to your Father Meyer, and he can take care of it if you want to make use of it. But Aquinas 101, the Thomistic Institute, if you just remember that, and go to that website, you can find everything you need there to study any of these topics. And you can become an expert in metaphysics if you want before you walk in the door of college, right? And you'll be much better off for doing it if you invest the time in that. Questions? Anything? Yes? What college did I go to? I went to a lot. I went to the University of Cincinnati for about 10 years. I was kind of a professional student. I spent 6 years in a Protestant seminary. I spent about 10 years at the University of Cincinnati, and then I spent another 6 years at a Catholic seminary. So I got a very broad exposure to a lot of different ways of thinking, right? I was raised Protestant, and I was exploring early on, besides archaeology and things of that sort, perhaps going into missions. I had traveled overseas and I was interested in helping people, and I went to some other countries and I was thinking about going into missions. But when I was in college, I had a problem. I couldn't harmonize faith and reason. So I left that world and I walked into UC, and I spent 10 years studying philosophy to try to sort some of this out. That's what helped me. Philosophy for me was what turned me toward Catholicism, right? It was philosophy that did that. It was trying to figure out, well, what's the basis for moral law, right? What's the basis for morality? And what should I think about, creation and evolution and how to harmonize them? And how should I understand God? And how should I understand the human mind, the human person? Am I a soul trapped inside a body? Am I a ghost in a machine? Is my body a machine? Or is the way to understand the human person better in terms of form and matter. You know, is it a consubstantial union of act and potency of form and matter? It was at the University of Cincinnati that I began to get some answers to the questions that were really, you know, I couldn't avoid them. And it was you know, at UC, look, most of my professors were atheists. And I was really trying to hang on to my faith and, you know, and say, you know, I don't want to throw just faith out the window and just forget it. I really want to find a way to make sense of this and integrate it. And it was from Thomas Aquinas and the Dominicans and his disciples, you know, people influenced by him, but also Blessed John Duns Scotus and several other Catholic philosophers that really helped me sort things out to where I could hang on to my faith. So, having endured that purgatory of philosophy at UC and all that was thrown at me there, which was a boatload, right? I came out of there and went off in a Catholic direction and became a deacon, right? And so now I work as a professor of philosophy, and I teach philosophy of science and philosophy of nature, metaphysics and logic, but I learned a lot of that just trying to hang on to my faith at UC. But thanks for asking. That was my path, right? I really wouldn't recommend you going to UC. I'm sorry, but I just think it's a bad move. I think you'd be better off going to a good Catholic institution, you know, like Franciscan's University, or Ave Maria, or our daughter went to Marian University in Indianapolis. They have a great program there called the San Damiano program, which if you're Catholic and you can get into that, it's a full scholarship. But it's not a full scholarship, but it pays for a lot, right? So our daughter got her school debt paid off within the first year she got out, and it was because of San Damiano program at Marian University. That was a good program, and it was a good ethos. It was a good Catholic environment. So I would really, recommend you not going through the purgatory that I went through over there at UC. It was difficult because I had to deal with that kind of Richard Dawkins attitude toward, the Christian faith. And a lot of times I didn't have the answers that I needed. But I got beat up enough, eventually I began to have some answers, right? So that, once you get beat up a few times, and you just try to have something to say. But it's kind of hard to take that for a while, and it's much better to learn, how to do this in a Catholic environment. So I always encourage, stay in a Catholic ethos, through all the way through college if you can. That's my recommendation. But if that's not possible, then plug into the campus ministry and get the resources you need to make it work, right? All right, any other questions or anything else?
Well, if we could give a
All right.
applause, thank you.
All right, thank you.